Good afternoon, everyone. I'm not going to do any intros because you just had them. I'll just say that these are my 4 prisoners for the next 30 minutes, and no one else is allowed to touch them. We're going to jump right in. Eli, I'm going to start with you. We have very choppy waters in the Indo-Pacific right now. How do you think allies and partners can better navigate those waters? What are your suggestions? What's your advice?
Well, it's a great question. First of all, let me say thank you for the opportunity to be here. Great to be at the CNAS annual conference, always a premier event around town. Look, it's a difficult time for allies and partners for a number of reasons. The regional security environment in the Indo-Pacific is growing more severe. There are questions about the U.S. commitment to the region, and there are concerns about the U.S. relationship with Beijing, and then, of course, Beijing's own ongoing coercion and assertiveness around the region. So a lot of challenges. I think the way that the region is largely responding is through a set of activities that aren't totally new. Some of them were already underway, but they're being accelerated. Number one, self-strengthening. They got to strengthen their own capabilities. Number two, working more with other allies and partners, so really great connectivity within the region, for instance, between Japan and Australia being probably the premier example, though there are others. And then, of course, updating and revising their relationship with the United States. And I think that's what has the big question mark over it. If you're asking for my advice and recommendation, my advice and recommendation would be, even though this is a difficult time, the right way forward is to drive toward greater integration with the United States. That's the way to ensure U.S. commitment, to build greater alliance and collective capacity and capability, rather than pursuing a path of too much independence and autonomy. I'm just back from Europe, where I was last week. Similar but different set of conversations there. But I think the road toward a strategic autonomy is a road toward fragmentation, and one in which we're going to have less capability overall and greater instability. So it is, I think, a question of, yes, make yourself stronger, diversify, but also integrate more deeply with the United States.
Ambassador, can I ask you, I mean, a lot of rhetoric gets focused on, particularly Donald Trump's rhetoric. Sometimes you have to separate the rhetoric from action. And I was at an event recently where an unnamed ambassador from India might have said that actually cooperation between allies and partners on the ground, in the air, and on the sea was actually quite strong. How do you kind of reconcile the two things?
Yeah. First of all, thank you so much for inviting me to this important forum. I would partly pick up from what Eli was referring to. But before that, I think we need to take into account what some of the basic and foundational realities of the Indo-Pacific are, which is one, that the economic center, economic gravity of the world has to a very large extent shifted to that part of the world. Accompanied by that is, of course, the rise of China, but also rise of India, and also the uniquely instructive position that ASEAN has taken. That said, there are a set of challenges which the countries of the Indo-Pacific have faced in the past and have continued to face. In a way, I would say COVID-19 gave us the first reality check to the product concentration, supply chain concentration in one geography, leading to challenges for the world. A related aspect of it is the larger supply chain concentration challenges in the Indo-Pacific, challenges of economic, in particular technology security, which emerge out of it. There is, of course, strategic aggressive behavior in the Indo-Pacific. Now, when in 2019, Prime Minister of India launched an initiative called Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative. The idea was to be able to work with the regional partners to mitigate the challenges that we face and amplify the opportunities that come our way. What countries of Quad have been able to do together, not just among themselves, but through them with the wider Indo-Pacific, has really been quite commendable. We had a very successful the third meeting of the Quad foreign ministers very recently in Delhi. This is the third meeting of this administration. And if you look at the concrete things that they have agreed to do between them, and that's the point which I was referring to, that you do more, you strengthen your own capabilities, which of course as India we continue to do, but also you need to strengthen the capabilities of others, either bilaterally or through partnership in the Quad. So for example, in the previous iteration of Quad, we had agreed to do something known as Indo-Pacific Maritime Domain Awareness. You have a comprehensive maritime picture of the Indo-Pacific, not just for yourself, but also for the other Indo-Pacific country. This time we upgraded it to say Indo-Pacific Maritime Surveillance Initiative. Most recently, the Pax Silica Initiative. To the extent the technology security extend to silicon-based supply chains, and the countries partnered among themselves and with the US in that context is extremely important. So I would say that if you want to look actually at the empirical evidence of what the countries, the Indo-Pacific and Quad countries in particular have been doing between them, it is very robust, it is very strong, and that points to the real cooperation which is actually happening on the ground.
Do you think countries, the Quad members, are doing enough to advertise to the average person on the street what the Quad does?
I think you can always say this about narrative building, that, enough is never enough. You can always do more. But I think the key thing is the empirical things, the real things that you do on the ground which benefit the country. I think that's far more important than just building a narrative which then doesn't have an underlying asset to it.
Lisa, recently, in Washington, everyone's focused on Iran for the most part. The media can be a little bit myopic. Scarborough Shoal near the Philippines is back in the news, not really here, but certainly in Asia in a bigger way. Can you explain what is happening right now and how worried should we be about it?
Yeah, well, thank you for the question. And I think it's important because when we think about the Indo-Pacific and Chinese coercion, military activity, we often think of the Taiwan Strait, and we forget about the coercive campaign against the Philippines in the South China Sea, which has really been happening over the last 5 years and longer, but it's intensified in the last several years. And so what's happened at Scarborough Shoal in late May, the Philippines detected a floating structure that the Chinese had there at the opening of the shoal. It since has gone inside, and Philippines officials have said, they think this is a pretext to, an eventual kind of occupation of the area. And, we have several examples of China doing similar things in the past, whether it's Mischief Reef, where they eventually established an airstrip. And, this is something that China is doing to try to assert its expansive 9-line claims, which of course the Hague arbitration that was decided in 2016 has ruled as illegal, that it's China, it's not legal for it to make these expansive claims, but still it's trying to do so through campaigns of coercion and intimidation. And from 2022 till 2025, we saw what they were doing to try to stop supplies to the Second Thomas Shoal, where there is a ship there that has been there many, many years that has Philippine service members there and need to be resupplied with food and other items. And what the Chinese did was try to stop these resupply missions by various means, water cannons, for example, even injuring a Philippine service member at one point. So I see this as part of their ongoing campaign to try to assert their expansive maritime claims. And I think right now they're testing to see how the United States will react, because of course the United States is focused on Iran. And so it's not surprising to me that they are doing some of this provocative activity right now to see how the US will respond. Will they really back the Philippines? And so far the US is. They held a cooperative maritime activity with the Philippines in late May near the area. And so I think that the U.S. is supporting the Philippines. This has been a relationship that the Trump administration has really prioritized. They've increased military assistance, and we saw a visit by President Marcos Jr. last year to the White House. So I think that we can count on the Trump administration to back the Philippines at this time, but it's just a reminder that Chinese military coercion is not only happening in the Taiwan Strait, it's also happening in the South China Sea.
Do you worry more about an accident or an incident spiraling into something broader at the Second Thomas Shoal or Scarborough Shoal or Taiwan? Which would you be most concerned about?
Well, I think I would be most concerned about Second Thomas Shoal because of the aggressive activities that we had seen over the last few years, and the fact that, the U.S. and the Philippines have a military treaty that compels the U.S. to, defend the Philippines if they come under attack. And so I think if you were to have a Philippine service member killed or several killed in one of these coercive activities, that there would be real questions about how the U.S. reacts, and that opens up the door for miscalculation and potential conflict. So I think this is something that doesn't get talked about very much, but is something I have been sort of personally concerned about for several years, and I think this is just a reminder that we do have treaty commitments to the Philippines. China has been acting increasingly aggressive toward the Philippines, and they may be in a mode where they want to test United States resolve because they see that the United States is distracted by Iran.
Well, this is an expert audience, but for anyone who doesn't know what the Sierra Madre is, please Google it, Google Images, and look at a picture of the ship, which I think is the most interesting story actually covered in 25 years. It should be a book. David, I'm going to come to you. If you want to weigh in on the first question, please do as well. But I want to ask you about tech competition. You've just come from testifying on the Hill about export controls. You were in the NSC for a while last year, where that would have been one of your focuses. The Pentagon last week put out its Chinese military companies list. The FCC has been taking actions on China kind of quietly, but quite effectively. The Commerce Department has almost gone into reverse on export controls. If you're speaking to someone who's coming at this, with little knowledge, how do you kind of reconcile and explain the Trump administration's policy on tech competition?
Well, I think in the export control space, we've certainly seen a shift in some of the trajectory and some of the momentum in the second Trump administration from the first Trump administration and the Biden administration before it, which really had prioritized export controls, especially on semiconductors for advanced AI. And both in that first Trump administration and in the Biden administration, taken fairly expansive and novel actions, with uses of aspects of export controls in the first Trump administration that hadn't been seen before, and sort of an application of their scope to China-wide controls by the Biden administration in 2022 and 2023 that were really important and significant and have been effective. Controls, for example, on Dutch lithography equipment going to China, put in place in 2019 and sustained since then, have had an enormous effect in preventing China from being able to indigenize the manufacture of the most advanced chips. I think in the Trump administration, what we're seeing today is that President Trump and the administration have been clear that they don't want to allow the most advanced US chips to go into China. Blackwell's, for example, from NVIDIA. President Trump made that clear in November and has made it clear repeatedly since then. The White House's AI action plan released last summer was also clear about the importance of preventing the flow of advanced technology to our adversaries in general, and then in particular to the importance of controlling semiconductor manufacturing equipment so that China can't indigenize domestically the manufacture of advanced chips, and working with our allies, especially the Dutch and the Japanese, on that. The follow-up has been certainly a lot quieter than in the previous two administrations. There have been talks with the Dutch and the Japanese, for example, on harmonizing our controls, but they haven't yet borne fruit. One of the things that we discussed in the testimony this morning with the Banking Committee was that there's a bill in the Congress, the so-called Match Act, to encourage the administration to perhaps strengthen its threats to the Dutch and the Japanese to take measures in our export control regime to really force the issue, even among these very important allies. And so, I mean, that's one area that is really extremely important and a little bit in flux. And then I'll flag one more, which has an Indo-Pacific geography especially, and that's the question of smuggling. China seems to have been able to acquire quite a significant amount of advanced compute, especially Blackwells, through Southeast Asia. And it's hard to get precise estimates about the volumes because this is inherently a black market activity, but some of the median estimates assess that something like a third of all of China's known compute could be coming through cutouts and diversion networks in places like Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, and elsewhere. And that is an enormous challenge. It's a challenge to our export control enforcement and to the integrity of our controls. And it's an important matter for the tech competition, and it's an important matter diplomatically in the region.
If I can ask you something slightly wonky.
More wonky than all of that?
Yeah. Earlier in the year, President Trump said to Jensen Huang, you can export H200 chips, which are still very powerful, to China. So far, really none have been exported in any kind of a major way. And the question is that because the Chinese don't want to allow them in because they want to encourage the domestic industry, or are the license conditions on the chips so tight that the Chinese are saying it's not worth it? Why are the chips not flowing?
I think the honest answer is we don't know. You've pointed to two of the factors, and I'll add one or two others. Broadly, the story is as you've put it. President Trump said in December that he in general would support the export of these H200s because they are not the most advanced NVIDIA chips, but they're a step down, which is true, although the chips also have a lot of computing power, and if they flowed in significant volumes to China, they would strengthen China's compute base very substantially. In January, the Commerce Department put licensing rules on how those chips would flow, and they actually had some important strictures in them. They said, for example, that in order to actually export H200s, the companies involved would have to certify that the buyers in China are not tied to the military, and that the sale of these chips to China would not steal capacity from buyers in the United States. Those are hard standards to actually meet if these rules are going to be enforced strictly. And this relates in a way, by the way, to the question about the Pentagon's new 1260H expanded blacklist, because one of the companies on that list, for example, is Alibaba. Another is Tencent. These are companies that are now designated by the Pentagon as associated with China's military. And it's not clear how then, under Commerce Department export rules, they can be licensed buyers of these advanced chips because the export rules are supposed to prevent the buyers from being associated with China's military. But then you have the other question, which is, to what extent does China really want the chips? And the answer is, there are special interest politics in China as there are here. And on the one hand, you have hyperscalers in China, companies like Alibaba and Tencent, those in the government who are sensitive to their interests, and they absolutely want the chips. They want the compute, they want it for domestic Chinese purposes, and they want it to enable them to better compete in third markets to build Chinese data centers all around the world. China's AI labs also want the compute. Just ask them. They will say over and over that the main thing holding back the progress in these Chinese AI labs is the compute constraints and the US and allied export controls. But there are others in China, including Huawei and others, who want to indigenize the manufacture of chips, and who see a benefit in actually keeping the market starved of this foreign compute so that there's an even greater demand for the indigenous Chinese stuff. The third factor, though, that we now need to take into account is smuggling, because there have been reports now of, for example, a significant loophole in US regs that emerged about a year ago that wasn't closed until a peculiar Commerce Department Sunday press statement 2 weeks ago, where it's possible that very significant volumes of Blackwell chips were actually being exported legally, as it were, to the subsidiaries of Chinese companies outside of China. And if that's the case, then China, through these overseas subsidiaries, has had much greater access to the most advanced US compute, like servers full of Blackwells, in a way that might make them less interested in the H200s and also help explain why they haven't actually sought H200s in large volumes.
Let me ask you one quick follow-up, which then segue into you, Ambassador, to ask about resilience of supply chains in the context of US-China tech competition. There's been a lot of debate in recent years, are we decoupling or de-risking? Where are we right now on that spectrum?
I think we're a lot closer to de-risking.
De-risking, okay. Ambassador.
What's the question?
So where are we in terms of making supply chains more resilient in the context of the US-China tech competition, whether it's packed silica or some of the other things that are out there?
I think if you were to look at our own journey of industrial development, it has been our own organic effort as part of larger objective of economic growth and prosperity in India, to build our own, as much of our own supply chains as possible when it comes to, I would say, products, services, manufacturing, and the underlying technology thread which moves into that. A lot of it has also, as a result, produced and given us supply chains, which are global supply chain, which are centered in India, and as a result has produced a degree of supply chain risk diversification, at least in those product, services, and technologies. Now, we are definitely not there in the 200 series or a Blackwell series of compute, but we do have our own Indian semiconductor mission, which is currently focused on legacy nodes, which still has a fairly long runway in terms of not just production, but also, I think, consumption in the user cases that get built on it. If all goes well, that should be in production by next year, which will give a very resilient, reliable, and trusted supply chain ecosystem for the legacy nodes on the CPU side. It's not necessarily on the GPU side. That's one. We have had, within the last, I would say, in less than 36 months, from June 23 to February 26, advanced memory test and packaging facility of Micron from groundbreaking in June 23 to commissioning in February 26 on the ground. Now that gives you another layer of that set of silicon-based supply chain. So packed silica could be a larger kind of umbrella terminology, but if you want to look at production nodes of some of those silicon-based supply chains, consumption, yes, of course, we are also very fast-growing consumer of the silicon-based supply chain. Other aspect which I would mention, which is a very important component of India-US partnership, but also a crucial element of Quad partnership, is the supply chain diversification in the critical mineral space. And I would particularly point out rare earths. Whether it's the production part of it again, or it is even the trading part of it, on which there have been efforts in the recent administration, quite successful efforts, I would say, to frame an agreement on the trade in the rare earths. And the idea is that if the countries, important countries which have the production technology, refining, processing technology, and then countries like India, which have a large consumption base and also a bit of a production base, can come together to ensure that that segment of economic growth is de-risked. So you could use de-risking and decoupling as a terminology, but I think on the ground, this is what is happening, not just in terms of our own efforts, but the efforts that we do with our partners, in particular the US. We in the previous administration, had this signature initiative called the Critical and Emerging Technologies, which essentially covered AI infrastructure, quantum to a very large extent, and parts of the nuclear. That initiative was rechristened as Trust, or let us Capital, in the new administration, and the substantive cooperation on the ground under that rubric is progressing quite well, I should say.
So just in terms of a one-word answer, are you optimistic or pessimistic that the US will achieve what it says it wants to achieve, so that within 2 years it can sufficiently reduce Chinese dominance over rare earths that China can no longer hold US and allies hostage?
I'm very optimistic of India-US partnership in building the supply chains, which will give us each other reliance on.
And the others?
Others need to figure it out themselves.
Okay. I want to ask, sorry, David, did you want to say something?
I was going to say, just quickly, there's I think, kind of a poignant connection between the point that the ambassador made on legacy chips and the point on critical minerals, which is that if we don't get legacy chips right, we will have, by 2030, a China-related problem in legacy chips like we have today in critical minerals. And the need to get greater cooperation, US-India, US-Taiwan, US-Japan, on legacy chips. I mean, we over-focus on the sexy, advanced GPU stuff at our peril, and the legacy stuff's really very important.
I want to ask about the Beijing summit, because if I don't, Richard Fontaine will not invite me back next year. Let's just go down the line. What do you think is, from your perspective and the things you're focused on, what was the most important takeaway from the summit for you? Eli, why don't we start with you?
Well, I think for me, the most important takeaway was that the summit did not change the trajectory of what was already a Trump administration shift in US-China policy away from one focused on competition to one more focused on deference and management of the relationship. And you had seen the administration already making compromises on things like semiconductors and Taiwan policy in advance of the trip, and the meeting itself seemed to reinforce that trajectory. And I think right now we're on a course for another leader-level meeting, and we haven't seen a demonstrable shift in that approach. So I think, again, the meeting itself, not particularly significant. The damage had been done beforehand, and it reinforced what are some concerning trends in administration policy.
Lisa?
Well, I think the most concerning thing for me was President Trump's comment that arms sales to Taiwan are a negotiating chip with China, which I think was quite a worrisome remark. That's not something that has been U.S. policy in the past, and I think it has led, a lot of our Indo-Pacific allies and partners to question whether the U.S. is going to remain as committed to defending Taiwan. Now, on the other side of that, I think President Trump, in his sort of unpredictable ways, has also said he might end up calling President Lai to discuss this issue, which would also be a first, a U.S. president talking directly to the president of Taiwan. And then also, Trump has supported, the highest level of arms sales to Taiwan of any U.S. president. So I think it's, we still have to see how all of this is going to play out, but I agree with Eli that it's the continuation of a trend, the focus on trade as the priority area, trying to stabilize the relationship, trying to set aside, some of the security issues, some of the more thorny issues in the relationship, and we don't see how that's going to quite pan out yet. But I would also say that the Iran war cuts both ways when it comes to China and how it's perceiving U.S. and U.S. power. On the one hand, the U.S. looks like it's distracted. We've even seen some military assets leave the Indo-Pacific region to, support the effort in Iran. We all know about munitions and how it's depleting munitions. And so on the one hand, people might say, oh, well, China might feel emboldened or empowered. And, as I mentioned in my previous remarks, we're seeing some coercion and aggression in the South China Sea. But on the other hand, it shows President Trump's willingness to use force. So I think, China has to take that into account when it thinks about its next moves on Taiwan. So I think that, we've yet to see how Trump's new approach to China will play out, but I think it does have our Indo-Pacific allies and partners on edge about, how committed the U.S. will remain to Taiwan's defense.
So just very quickly, how much of a litmus test is the pending $14 billion arms package, which was going to be 20 earlier in the year, but it's now back down to 14? How important is it that Trump goes ahead with that? Because as you say, he has actually approved more arms sales than any of his predecessors by a long shot already.
Well, I think he's made it a litmus test by bringing it up and saying it's a negotiating chip. I think that sent the wrong signal to China. So now it is a litmus test, and people are going to see whether he allows it to move forward. Yeah.
David, the summit.
I think one thing that we didn't see, and we might yet see, but for now it's kind of outside the known scope of the discussions between Washington and Beijing, and that's a very welcome thing, is the subject of large Chinese investments in the United States, like in automobile factories. We haven't seen this yet. I think the longer we go without seeing it, the better.
So the fact that that didn't come out of the summit was Ambassador from Delhi, what did the summit look like?
Okay, I think what I'll say is that if you were to look at what India and US have been trying to do in the bilateral space to the extent that it strengthens that partnership in terms of mitigating the challenges that are coming up in the Indo-Pacific, one of the key things, central thing in that has been to build the trusted technology ecosystems. And then that has several sub-verticals to it. If you ask me, I would say we are not seeing any diminishing of that line of effort in terms of what we do on the ground. Of course, the defense and security piece is yet to play out. We'll see how that plays out. But in terms of our line of effort and on-the-ground cooperation in continuing to focus on building that trusted technology ecosystem, we are continuing apace.
But I think, Demetri, there is, and the ambassador can speak for India, but from all of the interlocutors I talk to around the region, 100% of them perceive a shift in U.S. policy toward a step down and away from the kinds of competitive strategies that we had seen from the previous administration. And one of the results of that is not just anxiety, it's that these countries are recalculating their own approaches to China, their own willingness to support Taiwan, their own willingness to engage in economic actions that might lead them with their necks stuck out against Beijing. So the effect of that is that it has a corrosive impact on the overall ability to build collective action that is necessary for scale and otherwise against the PRC, because partners are concerned, if I go forward on X, Y, and Z, how do I not know that the United States is not going to leave me hanging out there? And I think what we're going to see, and what we have already started to see, is reluctance there and recalculation that is really contrary to what we need instead, which is greater collective action.
We have 1 minute left, and if we go over time, I definitely won't get invited back, so I'm going to be strict. Very quickly, and Eli, I'm going to ask you first on Taiwan. Davidson window comes up in 6 months' time. Xi Jinping will start his 4th term as head of the CCP at the end of 2027, and the Taiwanese will have an election, presidential election in early 2028. How worried should we be about a conflict over Taiwan at this point in time?
Very quickly, I do not believe invasion is either imminent nor inevitable.
Well, and that's a talking point from the Biden administration.
And it was true. It wasn't just a talking point. And deterrence is possible. We know what the formula is. And Xi Jinping is facing a number of constraints, including within his own country and his own military. So I don't think we are facing a threat of imminent invasion, even with the Iran scenario. That said, I think 2028 is the new 2027. There could be a conflation of events there. that could come together, politics on both sides, and we ought to be worried about in the interim heightened coercion and how the Trump administration is prepared or not to respond to that, rather than waking up one day and seeing a bolt from the blue across the Taiwan Strait.
Right. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to end on what I'm now going to call the Ratner window, 2028.
No.
Kidding. Thank you very much.
Okay.